It was just another cold morning when she saw him, collapsed on the sidewalk, his expensive suit torn and dirty, his face pale as winter snow. She had every reason to walk away, but something in her heart wouldn't let her. Sarah Mitchell was 23, with auburn hair always tied in a messy bun and eyes that sparkled with kindness despite the hardships life had thrown her way. Working 3 jobs just to pay rent on her tiny studio apartment. She barely had enough for herself, let alone a stranger. But compassion had always been her greatest strength, and perhaps her greatest weakness. The man she found that morning was Alexander Blackwood, 32, heir to a billion-dollar empire, though she had no way of knowing this. His chiseled features and tailored clothes suggested wealth. But in that moment, he was just another human being in desperate need of help. The bitter Chicago winter had painted the streets with frost, and the early morning sun cast long shadows between the towering skyscrapers. Sarah was on her way to her first job at a small bakery on the corner of 5th and Main, a place where the smell of fresh bread masked the harsh realities of the neighborhood. This was a world where millionaires in their penthouses never crossed paths with girls like her, or so she thought. She knelt beside him, her worn sneakers soaking through from the melting snow. His breathing was shallow, and she could see a nasty cut on his forehead. Without hesitation, she pulled off her only warm scarf, a gift from her late grandmother, and pressed it against his wound. When he stirred, his deep blue eyes met hers, and for a moment, the whole world seemed to stop. "Please, don't call an ambulance," he whispered, his voice carrying an accent she couldn't quite place. "They can't know where I am." The fear in his eyes was real, and despite every logical thought screaming at her to walk away, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She helped him to his feet, supporting his weight as they stumbled toward her apartment building. Her apartment was 4 flights up, and with each step, she wondered what she was doing. This man, whoever he was, clearly came from money. His watch alone, which he kept trying to hide under his torn sleeve, looked like it cost more than she made in a year. But there was something vulnerable about him, something that reminded her that beneath all our circumstances, we're all just human. "I'm sorry," he murmured as she struggled with her door key while supporting him. "I'm so sorry to burden you like this." Sarah shook her head, finally getting the door open. "Everyone needs help sometimes," she said simply, "even men in $1,000 shoes." He looked down at his Italian leather Oxfords, now scuffed and wet, and despite everything, he almost smiled. Her apartment was tiny, just 1 room with a kitchenette and a bathroom so small you could barely turn around. Sarah felt a flush of embarrassment as she saw it through his eyes. The second-hand furniture, the cracked window she covered with plastic, the pile of overdue bills on her small table. But if he judged, he didn't show it. Instead, he collapsed onto her pull-out couch with a grateful sigh. "Let me look at that cut," Sarah said, switching into caretaker mode. It was easier than thinking about the insanity of having a complete stranger in her home. She grabbed her first aid kit, well-stocked despite her poverty, because in her neighborhood, you never knew when you'd need it. As she cleaned his wound, he watched her with those intense blue eyes, seeming to memorize every detail of her face. "Why are you helping me?" he asked quietly. Sarah paused in her ministrations. It was a fair question. In a city where everyone minded their own business, where stepping over homeless people was normal, why had she stopped? "My grandmother used to say that we're all just one bad day away from needing help," she answered. "Today was your bad day. Tomorrow it might be mine. If you believe that love can bloom where no one expects, maybe it's time to join us on this journey." Over the next 3 days, a routine developed. Sarah would wake before dawn, leave him sleeping on her couch, and head to her first job at the bakery. She'd return at lunch with day-old pastries and sandwiches, check on him, then rush to her afternoon shift at the grocery store. Evenings were spent at the diner until nearly midnight, and then she'd come home to find him reading one of her few books, looking better each day. They talked during her brief breaks, and Alex, as he told her to call him, was fascinated by her life. He asked about her jobs, seeming genuinely interested in the details of kneading bread or the difficult customers at the diner. In return, he told her vague stories about working in business and traveling the world. Sarah wasn't naive. She knew he was hiding something. But she also knew that everyone deserved their secrets. "You're remarkable," he said one evening as she heated up instant noodles for them to share. "3 jobs, and you still had the energy to help a stranger." Sarah laughed, but was tired. Remarkable is one word for it. Exhausted is another. He watched her stir the noodles with a plastic fork, his expression unreadable. "When was the last time you did something just for yourself?" he asked. Sarah thought about it and couldn't remember. Every moment was about survival, about making it to the next paycheck. On the 3rd night, Alex was well enough to move around the apartment. He insisted on cooking dinner, though he clearly had no idea how to work with her limited supplies. Watching a man who obviously hadn't cooked for himself in years try to make spaghetti on her temperamental hot plate was both endearing and hilarious. They ended up ordering Chinese takeout with the last of Sarah's tip money, eating straight from the containers while sitting on her floor. "Tell me about your grandmother," Alex said, noticing the small frame photo on her nightstand. Sarah's expression softened. "She raised me after my parents died, taught me everything important, how to stretch a dollar, how to find joy in small things, how to stay kind even when the world isn't kind back." Her voice caught slightly. "She passed 2 years ago. The medical bills. Well, that's why I worked 3 jobs." Alex set down his chopsticks, something shifting in his expression. "I'm sorry," he said, and she could tell he meant it. "My father died last year. Heart attack at his desk. He worked himself to death building an empire, and in the end, what did it matter? He died alone in his office at 2 a.m. It was the most personal thing he'd shared, and Sarah reached out instinctively, covering his hand with hers. That touch changed everything. What had been careful avoidance became electric awareness. Alex turned his hand palm up, interlacing their fingers, and they sat there in Sarah's tiny apartment. 2 people from different worlds finding something unexpected in each other. "I should go tomorrow," he said quietly. "I've imposed enough." Sarah nodded, though her heart sank. Of course he had to go back to whatever life he'd temporarily escaped. We have more stories like this coming. So don't forget to hit the like button and turn on notifications. The next morning, Sarah woke to find Alex dressed in the clothes she'd washed for him, looking almost like the man she'd found on the sidewalk, except for the warmth in his eyes when he looked at her. "Before I go," he said, "I need you to know that these 3 days, they meant more to me than you could possibly understand." He pulled out a business card, expensive cardstock with minimal text. "My direct line. If you ever need anything at all, call me." Sarah took the card without looking at it, tucking it into her pocket. "Take care of yourself, Alex," she said, trying to keep her voice light. "Try not to collapse on any more sidewalks." He laughed, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Sarah, he started, then stopped. Thank you for everything." And then he was gone, leaving her apartment feeling emptier than it ever had before. It wasn't until her break at the bakery that Sarah finally looked at the card. Alexander Blackwood, CEO, Blackwood Industries. Her hands shook as she Googled him on her phone. Article after article appeared. The young billionaire who'd taken over his father's company. The most eligible bachelor in Chicago. The ruthless businessman who doubled profits in his first year. There were photos from charity galas, pictures with beautiful women in designer gowns, headlines about million-dollar deals. Sarah felt sick. She'd shared her instant noodles with a billionaire. She'd given him her bed while she slept on the floor. She'd told him about her struggles, her debts, never knowing that he could solve all her problems with pocket change. Worse, she'd started to fall for him, for his quiet humor, his unexpected vulnerability, the way he listened like her words were the most important thing in the world. How stupid could she be? She almost threw the card away, but something made her keep it, tucked behind her grandmother's photo where she wouldn't have to see it, but couldn't quite let it go. She threw herself into work, picking up extra shifts, trying to forget those 3 strange days. But late at night, when exhaustion should have brought sleep, she found herself thinking about him, wondering if he thought about her too, or she'd just been an amusing adventure in how the other half lives. Meanwhile, across town in his penthouse office, Alexander Blackwood was discovering that returning to his life was harder than he'd imagined. Everything felt different. The obsequious employees, the shallow socialites, the endless meetings about profits and margins. He'd told his security team and family that he'd been at a private retreat, needing time to process his grief. No one questioned it. Alexander had always been private about his feelings. But he couldn't stop thinking about Sarah, about her laugh when he'd burned the spaghetti, about the way she'd carefully portion out their food to make sure he had enough, about how she'd worked 18-hour days and still found the energy to care for a stranger. He'd met hundreds of women who wanted him for his money, his status, his connections. Sarah was the first person in years who'd wanted nothing from him except his recovery. "You're distracted," Victoria Pemberton observed over lunch in an exclusive restaurant. She was everything his board wanted in a partner for him: beautiful, connected, from old money. Their families have been pushing for a merger, both corporate and personal. "Is everything all right?" Alex looked at her perfectly manicured nails, thought of Sarah's hands, chapped from washing dishes, gentle as they tended his wounds. "Everything's fine," he lied. "Would you have done the same?" "I'd love to know what you think." A week passed. Then, too, Alex found himself driving through Sarah's neighborhood, telling himself he was checking on a potential development site. The truth was, he was hoping to catch a glimpse of her. He'd parked outside the bakery one morning, watched her through the window as she served customers with that bright smile that didn't quite reach her eyes anymore. He wanted to go in, to explain everything, but what would he say? That he was sorry for lying? That he missed her instant noodles and tiny apartment? That she'd made him feel more human than he'd felt in years? Sarah, for her part, had good days and bad days. Good days were when she was too busy to think. Bad days were when she'd see someone in an expensive suit and her heart would race. The worst day was when she overheard customers at the diner talking about Alexander Blackwood's engagement to Victoria Pemberton. The photo in the business section showed them at a charity gala. Victoria's diamond necklace, probably worth more than Sarah would make in a lifetime. She told herself it was for the best. They belonged in different worlds. But fate, it seemed, wasn't done with them. 3 weeks after Alex had left, Sarah was working the late shift at the diner when a group of men in expensive suits came in. They were loud, drunk, celebrating some deal. She recognized one of them from a photo she'd Googled. Thomas Pemberton, Victoria's father. They were obnoxious, demanding, treating her like she was invisible. And then she heard them talking about the Grant Street development. "Blackwood's finally on board," Thomas slurred. "That whole neighborhood's coming down, going to make us millions." Sarah's blood ran cold. Grant Street was her neighborhood, her building, home to hundreds of families who'd lived there for generations. When another man asked, "Announcements next month, then 6 months to eviction. Going to be beautiful, luxury shops, high-end condos. Finally clean up that eyesore." Sarah's hands shook as she poured coffee. This was Alex's company they were talking about. The man she'd saved, nursed back to health, started to fall for. He was going to destroy her home. She managed to finish her shift, but barely. That night, she pulled out his business card for the first time since she'd hidden it. She stared at it for a long time, anger and betrayal warring in her chest. Then she put it back. What was the point? He'd made his choice. The announcement came as promised. Blackwood Industries held a press conference announcing the Grant Street development project. Alex stood at the podium, looking every inch the Billionaire CEO, as he outlined plans that would displace thousands of people. Sarah watched on the break room TV at the grocery store, her heart breaking all over again. Had he known when he was staying with her? Had he walked her streets, eaten her food, all while planning to destroy it all? But if Sarah had looked closer, she would have seen the tension in Alex's jaw, the way his hands gripped the podium. She would have noticed that he didn't smile once during the announcement, that his answers to questions were curt, almost hostile. She didn't see him leave immediately after, ignoring Victoria's call about celebrating, and drive to the one place he'd felt peace in years, only to find Sarah's apartment building already marked with a development notice. The protest started immediately. Sarah threw herself into organizing, using the same energy she'd once used for survival to fight for her community. They held rallies, contacted media, started a petition. It felt hopeless, What could a bunch of poor families do against a billion-dollar corporation? But it was better than giving up. She carried a sign with her neighbors, chanting outside Blackwood Industries, never expecting to see him again. But Alex saw her from his office window. He watched the crowd below, and his eyes found her immediately. She looked exhausted, thin, but her spirit was unbroken. He wanted to run down, to explain that this wasn't his plan, that he was trapped by a contract his father had signed, by a board that would oust him if he showed weakness. But he knew how it would sound. Poor little rich boy, trapped in his golden cage. Quite the spectacle, Victoria said, entering his office without knocking. She'd taken to doing that lately, marking her territory. Don't worry, darling. Security will clear them out soon enough. Alex turned from the window. They have a right to protest, he said quietly. Victoria laughed, that crystalline sound that grated on his nerves. Oh, Alexander. Still playing the humanitarian? It's not attractive. That night, unable to stand it anymore, Alex did something reckless. He put on jeans and a hoodie, clothes he bought specifically for this purpose, and went to the coffee shop on Grant Street. It was a risk. His security team would be furious if they knew, but he had to try to explain to make her understand. He waited for 2 hours, nursing the same cup of coffee, hoping she'd walk in. She didn't. Instead, it was Sarah who made the next move. Desperate to save her home, she decided to use the card he'd given her. Not for herself, never for herself, but for her community. She called his direct line, her heart pounding. When he answered, his voice professional and distant, she almost hung up. Mr. Blackwood, she said formally, this is Sarah Mitchell. You might not remember me, but Sarah... His voice changed completely, warm and shocked. Of course I remember. How are you? Are you okay? Do you need... She cut him off. I'm calling about the Grant Street development. We need to talk. The warmth left his voice, replaced by something tired. I can't discuss active projects. I'm sorry. You owe me a conversation, she said firmly. One conversation. That's all I'm asking. They agreed to meet at the same coffee shop, where he'd waited for her. This time, he brought Victoria. He told himself it was for propriety, to keep things professional. The truth was, he didn't trust himself alone with Sarah. When Sarah walked in and saw Victoria, her face shuddered. This wasn't the man she'd helped. This was Alexander Blackwood, billionaire CEO, complete with his elegant fiancée. Miss Mitchell, Victoria said coolly, looking Sarah up and down. Alex has told me so much about you. How charitable of you to help him. The word charitable dripped with condescension. Sarah lifted her chin. I didn't know who he was, she said directly to Alex. Would it have mattered if you did? He asked, genuinely curious. Sarah met his gaze squarely. I'd like to think not. But then, I also never imagined the man I helped would destroy my home. The conversation went downhill from there. Alex tried to explain about inherited contracts, board pressure, fiduciary duties. Victoria interjected with comments about progress and the greater good. Sarah listened, her hope dying with each corporate speak excuse. Finally, she stood. I thought you were different, she said quietly. When you talked about your father dying at his desk, building an empire that didn't matter, I thought you understood. But you're just like him, aren't you? Just another rich man who sees people like me as obstacles to profit. Sarah, please, Alex started, but she was already leaving. That went well, Victoria said sarcastically. Honestly, Alexander, what did you expect? People like that don't understand business. Alex stared at the door Sarah had walked through, her words echoing in his mind. Just like his father. Is that what he'd become? When had he stopped being the man who'd promised himself he'd be different? The protests intensified. Media picked up the story. Billionaire destroys neighborhood that saved him, made for great headlines. Someone had leaked that Alex had stayed in the neighborhood, though the details were vague. His board was furious about the bad publicity. Victoria's father threatened to pull investments if Alex didn't get the situation under control. Every day, the pressure mounted. Sarah, meanwhile, had become the unofficial face of the resistance. She spoke at rallies, gave interviews, organized legal aid for families facing eviction. She was running on pure adrenaline and determination, but even her neighbors could see the toll it was taking. "You need to rest, Mija," her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Chan, told her. "What good are you to us if you collapse?" But Sarah couldn't rest, not when everything was at stake. The turning point came at a televised town hall. The mayor, trying to mediate, had arranged for community representatives to meet with Blackwood Industries. Sarah spoke for her neighborhood, passionate and articulate, painting a picture of the lives that would be destroyed. Alex, forced to attend by his board, watched her with a mixture of admiration and agony. She was magnificent, fierce and compassionate, everything he'd fallen in love with. "Mr. Blackwood," Sarah said, looking directly at him during the Q&A, "you once told me that your father died building an empire that didn't matter in the end. Tell me, what will matter when you're gone? The luxury shops you built, or the families you destroyed to build them?" The room went silent. Alex felt every eye on him, waiting for his response. Victoria grabbed his arm in warning, but he shook her off. "You're right," he said quietly, then louder. "You're absolutely right." The room erupted. His lawyers tried to intervene, but Alex stood. "My father spent his life accumulating wealth and power, and died alone because of it. I promised myself I'd be different, but somewhere along the way, I forgot that promise, until a woman showed me kindness when I needed it most, expecting nothing in return." He looked directly at Sarah. "I was wrong, and I'm going to fix it." The aftermath was chaos. His board called an emergency meeting. Victoria broke their engagement on social media before he even left the building. Investors threatened to pull out, but for the first time in months, Alex felt clear. He spent the night with his lawyers, looking for loopholes, ways to break the contracts without destroying the company entirely. It would cost millions, potentially billions. It would mean fighting his own board, possibly losing everything his father had built. But Sarah was right. What would matter in the end? Sarah watched the news in disbelief. Alexander Blackwood, fighting his own company to save Grant Street. The media was calling it corporate suicide. Financial analysts predicted the end of Blackwood Industries. She wanted to call him, to ask if he'd lost his mind, but she didn't know what to say. Part of her, the part that remembered 3 days of quiet conversation and shared meals, wanted to help him. The practical part reminded her that this wasn't her fight. But when Thomas Pemberton went on TV, calling Alex weak and manipulated by a nobody gold digger, Sarah's protective instincts flared. She knew what it was like to be called a nobody, but Alex didn't deserve to be torn apart for doing the right thing. Before she could talk herself out of it, she was at Blackwood Industries, using the card he'd given her to get past security. She found him in his office at 2 a.m., surrounded by papers, looking exhausted but determined. "You shouldn't be here," he said when he saw her, but his eyes said otherwise. "Neither should you," she countered. "Your father died at his desk, remember?" He laughed, short and bitter. "Ironic, isn't it? Fighting to undo his legacy in the same office where he built it. Why are you doing this?" Sarah asked. "You'll lose everything." Alex looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since that morning he'd left her apartment. "I already lost everything that mattered when I became someone you couldn't respect," he said simply. "My father's empire isn't worth that." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "Alex, don't," he said gently. "This isn't about us. This is about doing what's right. You showed me that. If this story resonates with you, perhaps it's time to believe that people can change, that love can transform even the hardest hearts." Subscribe to hear more stories of unexpected connections. The board meeting was scheduled for Monday. All weekend, the business news speculated about the showdown. Would Alexander Blackwood really destroy his father's company for a principle? Sarah wanted to be there to support him somehow, but knew her presence would only make things worse. Instead, she waited with her neighbors, everyone glued to news updates. Alex walked into that boardroom, knowing he was outnumbered, but he'd spent the weekend doing more than just preparing legal arguments. He'd been making calls, finding investors who believed in sustainable development, in businesses that helped communities rather than destroyed them. It wasn't enough to win outright, but it was enough to fight. "Gentlemen," he began, looking around the table at men who'd known him since he was a child. "And ladies," he added, nodding to the two women on the board. "We stand at a crossroads. We can continue my father's path. Profitable, certainly, but at what cost? Or we can choose a different way. A better way." He clicked his presentation remote, and instead of profit projections, the screen showed faces. Sarah's face, Mrs. Chen's, the children who played in Grant Street's small park. "These are the people we're talking about displacing," he continued. "Not statistics. People. And I've found investors who believe, as I do, that we can be profitable without being predatory." The room erupted in arguments. Thomas Pemberton called him naive. Others threatened lawsuits. But a few board members, younger ones who perhaps had their own moments of doubt, looked thoughtful. The vote was closer than anyone expected. In the end, Alex lost by 1 vote. Just one, but he'd expected that. What he hadn't expected was for 3 board members to approach him afterward, interested in his vision. "If you start something new," one said quietly, "something that proves profit and principles can coexist, I'm in." It wasn't enough to save Grant Street yet, but it was a beginning. Sarah heard the news from Mrs. Chun, who'd been watching on her small TV. "He lost," the elderly woman said sadly. "But he tried. Mija, that boy tried." Sarah nodded, throat tight. She'd been so angry at him for so long. She'd forgotten that beneath the billions, he was just human. A man tried to do better than his father, sometimes failing, but trying. That night, she found him at the coffee shop on Grant Street. He was slumped in a corner booth, still in his suit from the board meeting, looking defeated. She slid into the seat across from him, without asking. "I heard," she said simply. He looked up, surprised to see her. "I failed," he said. "You tried," she countered, echoing Mrs. Chun. "That matters." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Alex said, "I'm not giving up. I'm starting something new. Ethical development. Sustainable communities. It'll be smaller, harder, but..." He trailed off. "But it'll matter," Sarah finished. He nodded. "I could use help," he said carefully. "Someone who understands communities, who knows what people really need. Someone who isn't afraid to tell me when I'm being an idiot." Sarah laughed, the first real laugh in weeks. "Are you offering me a job, Mr. Blackwood?" "I'm offering you a partnership," he corrected. "Equal say. Your community knowledge, my business experience. Together, maybe we can actually make a difference." Sarah studied him. This wasn't the broken man she'd found on the sidewalk, or the cold CEO from the press conference. This was something in between. Someone who'd learned from both extremes. "What about Grant Street?" she asked. Alex pulled out a folder. 3 board members and I are forming a coalition. We're buying out the development rights. It'll take time, and I'll have to liquidate most of my personal assets. But we can stop it. Sarah's eyes widened. "Your personal assets?" "Alex, that's..." "Money," he finished. "Just money. I've learned there are more important things." The media had a field day with the story. Billionaire loses fortune for love, made for even better headlines than the protests had. But it wasn't that simple. Over the next months, as Alex built his new company and fought to save Grant Street, it became clear this wasn't a fairy tale. It was hard work, late nights, and plenty of setbacks. But it was also partnership, shared purpose, and slowly, carefully rebuilt trust. Sarah did join his company, but not as an employee. She became his co-founder, bringing community insight he'd never have found in a boardroom. They butted heads often, her passion versus his pragmatism, but somehow they balanced each other. The new company, Mitchell Blackwood Community Development, she'd insisted her name come first, started small but grew steadily. The day they saved Grant Street, officially, legally, permanently, the whole neighborhood celebrated. Alex stood in the same spot where Sarah had found him that cold morning, but this time, he was surrounded by people who saw him not as a billionaire or a CEO, but as someone who'd fought for them. Mrs. Chun hugged him, telling him he was too skinny and needed to eat more. Children ran around his legs, playing, and Sarah stood beside him, No longer the exhausted girl with 3 jobs, but a woman who'd found her purpose. "You know," she said quietly, "when I found you that morning, I thought I was saving you." Alex took her hand, interlacing their fingers like he had that night in her tiny apartment. "You did," he said, just not the way either of us expected. She leaned into him, and he wrapped his arm around her. They'd started as strangers from different worlds, but somehow they'd built a bridge between those worlds. Would you have taken that chance? Would you have trusted someone who'd hurt you to change? Sometimes the greatest risk is believing in someone's ability to become better than they were. Their wedding, a year later, was held in the Grant Street Community Center, a building that now stood where luxury shops might have been. It wasn't a society wedding. Victoria Pemberton wasn't invited, and most of Alex's old circle had long since written him off. But the people who mattered were there. The community that had become family, the investors who believed in their vision, the board members who'd eventually supported the right choice. Sarah wore her grandmother's wedding dress, carefully altered and restored. Alex wore a simple suit, not designer, bought from a local shop on Grant Street. As they exchanged vows, promising to continue building bridges between worlds, to never forget that people matter more than profit, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Even Thomas Pemberton, who'd come to apologize and ask to invest in their company, had to wipe his eyes. "I should warn you," Sarah said during their first dance, "I still can't cook anything but instant noodles." Alex laughed, spinning her around. "I should warn you," he replied, "I still burn spaghetti." They were imperfect, both of them, products of their different worlds. But together, they were building something new, a life, a company, a future that proved love could indeed bloom when no one expected it. 5 years later, Mitchell Blackwood Community Development was a case study in business schools. How a billionaire and a baker's assistant had created a new model for ethical development, proving that you could do well by doing good. They'd revitalized dozens of neighborhoods, always with community input, always ensuring no one was displaced. Alex often joked that Sarah was a real CEO. He just handled the numbers. Their daughter, Grace, named for Sarah's grandmother, grew up understanding both worlds. She played in Grant Street's park and attended board meetings in a baby carrier. She learned that wealth meant nothing without wisdom, that true success was measured in lives improved, not dollars accumulated. And every night, when Sarah tucked her in, she told her the story of how she'd once helped a stranger on the sidewalk, never knowing she was saving her future husband. "Mama," Grace asked one night, "would you have helped Daddy if you'd known he was rich?" Sarah thought about it, smoothing her daughter's hair, the same auburn as her own. "I hope so, sweetheart, but I'm glad I didn't know." Sometimes we need to see people without their labels, rich or poor, powerful or weak. Sometimes we need to just see their hearts. Alex, listening from the doorway, felt the same rush of love he'd felt that first morning, waking up in Sarah's tiny apartment to find her watching over him with concern. He'd had everything money could buy, but he'd been lost until a woman with nothing but kindness had shown him the way home. Their love story wasn't a fairy tale. It was better. It was real, built on choices made every day to see past differences and find common ground. Because in the end, that's what love is, not a dramatic rescue or a grand gesture, but the daily choice to build something together. Sarah had saved Alex from the cold, but more importantly, she'd saved him from becoming cold himself. And Alex had saved Sarah from a life of endless struggle, but more importantly, he'd helped her save her community and find her voice. Their story became legend on Grant Street, told to children as a reminder that kindness could change the world, that love could bridge any gap, that sometimes the most unlikely connections created the strongest bonds. And every winter morning, when frost painted the streets and long shadows stretched between buildings, someone will remember the day a simple girl helped a fallen man, never knowing she was helping a billionaire, never imagining that love was about to begin. If you made it this far, perhaps you believe, as Sarah and Alex learned, that the greatest fortunes aren't measured in bank accounts, but in the lives we touch, the communities we build, and the love we choose to nurture despite all odds. In a world that often tells us to stay in our lanes, to not get involved, to protect ourselves first, Their story reminds us that sometimes the most extraordinary journeys begin with the simplest act of human kindness. Remember to like and subscribe if you believe in the power of unexpected love and second chances. Because who knows, your own life-changing moment might be just around the corner, disguised as a stranger in need, waiting for you to make the choice that changes everything. And perhaps, just perhaps, that's the most beautiful truth of all, that love doesn't care about bank accounts or social status, about designer clothes or tiny apartments. Love cares about the heart that stops to help, the hand that reaches out, the voice that says, "Are you okay?" Love blooms where kindness is planted, even on the coldest sidewalks, even between the most unlikely people, even when the whole world says it's impossible. Sarah and Alex proved that impossible is just another word for having tried hard enough yet. And their love, born from a moment of compassion on a frozen Chicago morning, warmed not just their own lives, but an entire community, showing that when we choose love over fear, kindness over caution, and people over profit, we don't just change our own stories, we change the world.